My name is Logan Parker, and I'm a special species and habitat technician with the Maine Bird Atlas and a ecologist with the Maine Natural History Observatory. And we're going to go through the Adopt-a-Marsh program, which is one of our special species surveys that's conducted as part of the Atlas. Before we dive in, we'll go over a couple of the ground rules, and I'll give you a little overview of how this presentation is going to go. If you attended our owl presentation a few weeks ago, this will be a similar format, but very different in terms of species and protocol. So essentially, what we're going to do is we'll touch on the Maine Bird Atlas, but the majority of the time we're going to spend on the Adopt-a-Marsh project itself. If you have questions about the Atlas, we should be able to address some of those towards the end, but there are a lot of resources that are available that we can steer you towards, and we do have a kickoff event that's coming up, and we can give you the details for that event as well. This presentation will be recorded and made available online for folks that aren't able to join us today, so best behavior if you're unmuted and within the chat. We're going to hold all questions to the end of the meeting, so if you have something that comes up, feel free to put it in the chat. If it's something small, Glenn, the Atlas project coordinator, is here, and he might be able to address that question, or you're welcome to put something in that we'll reserve for the end of the meeting. So we'll go through the project. Like I said, we'll touch on the Atlas. Then we'll discuss the target species of this project and all of the methods that we use in the Adopt-a-Marsh project, from adopting a marsh to monitoring the marsh to atlasing within the marsh. All right. So the Adopt-a-Marsh program is a special species project of the Maine Bird Atlas, and that is to say it's one of our more targeted efforts. So where the Maine Bird Atlas is more generic, we're sending folks out into all sorts of different types of habitat, or making observations in their own backyard. This is a more structured project that volunteers can take part in, and it was launched in part because the number of these species are quite secretive and are often overlooked by traditional atlasing methods. So a number of these species are declining or are thought to be declining, but because they're so secretive, it can make that a challenge to know for sure, because they can just fall below the radar or disappear within the vegetation, as it happens so often with these species. So we've been working on this project now for the past few years, and we do have just 2 years remaining, and a number of marshes that we're hoping can be adopted and covered in the next few years. So we need your help. So just speaking in general, the Maine Bird Atlas is a statewide citizen science effort. This is the second generation of the Atlas. As you can see, the first generation was run over 30 years ago. It's a project that anyone can make observations in, regardless of your skill level. If you're a new birder, there's opportunities for you. Or if you're a more experienced birder, you can go out and look for some of the tougher species, or help us complete a number of Atlas blocks. It's a partnership among many organizations, and we're all working together on this massive project that's looking at the distribution of these species and the abundance of these species, so we can compare how things have changed over time. As I mentioned, the Adopt-a-Marsh project is a special species survey, and there are a number of special species surveys that are being conducted as part of the Atlas. We also have a nightjar monitoring project that's looking at whippoorwills and nighthawks, in addition to a number of other species that are active at twilight and on on nights with full moons. We have a owl monitoring project, which is currently underway. We just had a webinar on owl monitoring, and that is also available online. And actually, I think today is the first day of that project. We also have a number of nest box monitoring projects. We have boxes that are available for monitoring American kestrel, northern saw-whet owl or other small owl species, eastern bluebird, tree swallows, and then we also have a cliff swallow monitoring project using artificial clay cliff swallow nests. So these projects target these species that, as I mentioned, they're active at night when most of us are sleeping, or they're difficult to study, or in some cases we're able to confirm them more easily using projects like the nest box monitoring projects. We do have one more webinar coming up on these special species projects, and that's on the nightjar monitoring project. That's on May 5th at 6 o'clock. So if you go to the registration page on Eventbrite, those tickets I think are available now, and that's a free program. So the Adopt-a-Marsh project was initiated for a number of reasons. It's meant to track the changes in distribution and abundance of these secretive marsh birds, and to identify these areas for conservation and to guide land management. So it's in a sense, it's sort of like a mini version of the Maine Bird Atlas, which has very similar goals. This is just more targeted to these birds that would otherwise be missed. So there are 9 target species in this project. These are the 9. It doesn't mean that these are the only species you'll encounter, but these are the ones that we're looking for specifically. Some of these species are more conspicuous, others are difficult to spot, or you're likely not to see them at all. So it's important that you're familiar with and able to identify these 9 species by sight or by sound. And so we'll go through and talk about each one. And I will have recordings for you guys of each. So on the more conspicuous side, although they can be quite sneaky and skulky, the Piedbilled Grebe is a small grebe species that we find on freshwater lakes and brackish waters. They nest in emergent vegetation. They're highly territorial. Their vocalizations are super, super loud. You can usually hear them well across the water body they're on. And they later in the season they brood young on their backs. I think I have a photo of them, but they have really boldly colored young that you can see at specific times within the breeding season. Oh, and you'll see that I have the safe dates listed here. So that's an atlasing term. The safe dates are sort of the bookends on when we think that this species is on its breeding grounds and not a migratory species, a bird that's just passing through. That is primarily important for breeding codes, which are what we use to identify breeding behaviors, how we categorize them. It's primarily used for birds that you just see within suitable habitat or singing birds. So if you see, courtship behavior, or you see, a bird with young that falls outside of these safe dates, they're not as important, but they are important earlier in the season, especially. So let me play a recording of the Piedbilled Grebe. Hopefully this will come through okay for you guys. So a song-like vocalization. I'll play another one here with some calls. Hopefully you heard that okay.
Yep, that came through just fine, Logan.
Okay, great. Thanks, Glenn. So the next species we'll talk about here is the American bittern, and this is a species that can be really tough to spot. They are very, very secretive and well camouflaged. They blend into their breeding grounds really, really well, and they'll often posture themselves with their head held fully erect and pointed right up, and they can blend right into the vegetation that way. So they often nest near or over shallow water in marshes or wet meadows. They have a really unusual vocalization that they use as part of courtship. So I'll play that for you. It's sort of this very it's like a pumping sound. It's very strange, and you often hear this at dusk or during the early morning hours. So that's the song, so to speak, of the American bittern. Again, you can actually hear that over quite a long ways. If you're close enough, you can actually almost feel it. It's sort of like how you can feel a ruffed grouse drumming. If you're fairly close to one of these birds, you can feel it in your chest. Which I haven't been that close to many, but I have come across them. All right. So our other bittern species, the least bittern, also a highly secretive species. Probably one of the most secretive species we have in the state. They are the world's smallest heron. They're tiny, and if you do see them, you can find them clinging to vegetation over water. So they're quite light. Their song has been described as sounding somewhat like the vocalization of a cuckoo. So I'll play that for you. And this is a more raspy example, but it can sound almost like laughter. Let's see if there's another one. There you go. So this is one that's quite, because it's quite secretive and quite rare, we don't have a lot of observations of the species as part of the atlas. So this is one, we'll talk about this more later, but it's a high priority for, you'd want to take some notes, and if you can, get a recording of this one following the survey. But we'll talk about that more in a moment. All right, another small heron species, also quite secretive, is the green heron. You can often find them clinging to vegetation as well, but they're often on woody vegetation. They can form small colonies, and they have a really sort of sharp, loud vocalization that travels a long distance. So there's sort of a theme here, and that's that a lot of these species are hard to see, and but the majority of them are highly vocal, and so there's an emphasis here on knowing these vocalizations well, because they're likely to be the best observation you'll have is what you get through your ears. So let's listen to the green heron. So a very rough, almost bark-like vocalization from the green heron. So this next slide I included because I thought it was just kind of funny. So I say that these species are very secretive and hard to spot, but every once in a while you get lucky and you find you have an observation where you get to see the species clearly, and you know that this is a breeding conformation. This green heron was right out in the open near a wetland system surrounded by forest, and it was flying up to the trees and snapping off twigs right out in plain view. And this is a nice photo for, so in the previous image, you'll see they tend to be really haunched up and compact, but they do have a long neck, just like just like any other heron species. But you often see them sort of with their neck all folded in. But yeah, there it is, a great big long neck. All right, our next species, Virginia rail. So it's a small, dark rail species. I don't even know why I said this, but more often heard than seen. That's the case with all of these. They use a wide variety of habitat types during the breeding season, and they also have a range of vocalizations that are sort of metallic sounding, lots of clicking sounds, and then pairs will do this sort of grunted duet. So Virginia rails will build multiple nests before actually selecting one where they will incubate their young or their eggs, and they can sometimes use those platforms after the young have hatched as brooding platforms. So just seeing a Virginia rail on one of these nests isn't necessarily a confirmation, but it's still a very good clue that that species is breeding in your habitat. All right, so let's listen to Virginia rail. So not a super melodious song, but that clicking song is quite distinctive. Makes that grunting vocalization. And sometimes you can find pair members that are doing that back and forth, and that one's quite loud and can be heard over a distance. I apologize if I keep looking off to the side here. I'm split between two screens. So, all right. So our next species is another small rail species, a little bit more showy than the Virginia rail. Also highly vocal, has a whinny-like call and some sharp whistled notes. Often vocalizes near dusk or dawn, but you can get them they'll vocalize on rainy, overcast days, but not likely to encounter this one or hear this one in the middle of the day. So they build their nests straight in the vegetation, emergent vegetation near open water. Let's listen to the Sora. So this is a good one there's a good point here, and that's that you should familiarize yourself with the native amphibian species, because that vocalization sounds quite similar to spring peeper. So you'd want to be sure of what you're hearing. Let's see. Now that whinnying vocalization is much more distinctive. That's not something you're likely to confuse with another species. High whinnied vocalization descending. So that's one to listen for. All right. So this is one of the larger rail species. It's found on freshwater and brackish wetlands. This is another species we don't have many confirmations of. They do breed in Maine. They're interesting among the rails in that they're often in, generally with Virginia rail or Sora, you're seeing them skulking in the vegetation. this is a species you're likely to see actually swimming, out of the water, much like waterfowl. They're often in wetlands, with a lot of emergence, areas of small openings of water, and they have a wide range of vocalizations. Um, let's see. So it's been described as sort of, sounding like a cackle or laughter. Um, they will actually build a number of nests that they use for a number of purposes. So play the common Galano. So pretty harsh sounding vocalization, high and harsh. All right. All right, and another rail species, another large rail species, the American coot. This is one that's often described as chicken-like in appearance, and it's true. They're very stocky and do have a similar form. They are also likely to forage out in open water, and in fact, a lot of observations of the species happen during migration when larger flocks will stage on lakes and other water bodies. So they're quite visible that time of year. But in the summer, they're nesting on the margins of lakes or other water bodies. They're not as picky. You can see they are likely to end up at a sewage pond or just a wet ditch. They're willing to use whatever suits them. They also have a wide range of vocalizations. So let me play those for you. And these are just examples. There are numbers. So we'll point you towards resources for listening to these. So sort of a really harsh bugle-like sound. All right, and on to our last species, which is a strong contrast to the American coot, the sedge wren. So our only passerine songbird on the list. This is another highly secretive species. They tend to be, as you would expect, in sedge wetlands. They nest within dense vegetation in a variety of different wetland types, freshwater or coastal. They make a sort of balled nest with an opening, so it's got like a roof over the top of it, which is not as common. And they will construct a number of dummy nests. So they're likely to make more than one nest, and they're only going to use one of them. So let's listen to the sedge wren, a very high song. So hopefully that's coming through okay. I know the higher recordings can be tough. So a very high, kind of buggy song with the sedge wren. All right, so those are the 9 target species. So those are the ones that you need to be sure of. You need to know them by sight and sound. So of course they're not the only species that you're going to encounter while out in a marsh system. So there are a number of different songbirds that could be seen, waterfowl. There are other wading birds. So if you're familiar with more species, that's great. We'll talk about how you can document them as well. All right, so down to the methods for the Adopt-a-Marsh program, and there's the Piedbilled Grebe there that I was telling you about, the young Piedbilled Grebe. Pretty strong contrast to the adult. So there are a number of marshes all throughout the state. I think there were over 200 marshes that were identified as part of this project. Each of these marshes has a series of points, survey points. They could be a single point, or they can go all the way up to 8 individual survey points. Each point within the marsh has to be surveyed during each survey window, and we'll talk about that when we talk about timing. There are three windows. So you're visiting each of your points at a minimum of 3 times during the field season. Each individual point takes 14 minutes to survey, and it's a combination of just passive listening, so just arriving at a location and listening for what species you hear vocalizing, or scanning with your binoculars for other species, for the visible species, and playback survey. So we provide you with an MP3 file, and you pair that up with a speaker and broadcast that at your survey point. So I made this point in the OWL presentation. I'll make it again with this. It's important to note that playback has its pros and cons. So its value is that a number of these species are highly vocal and are likely to respond to vocalizations of their own species or of other wetland species. So using playback, we can get these species to vocalize that otherwise might be sitting silently within the habitat. On the flip side, using playback distracts those species from their breeding behaviors, and our goal here is to be as uninvasive as possible. So while we are going to be using playback, we recommend, playback cannot be used outside of these survey methods. So we have to limit the amount of playback and limit the amount of disturbance that we create. So you'll be recording all of the target species that you see or hear and the highest breeding code. Again, that's an atlasing term, but those are the categories of the different breeding behaviors, and we can talk about that more if people have specific questions. So I'll show you an example of our data sheet, what that might look like. So as you can see, there are a number of species that are observed. Many of these are not the target species. Swamp sparrow, red-winged blackbird, harrier. These are other species that were seen by this observer, and they marked what A or V, which is they either heard the bird, A, audio, or they saw the bird, visual. So they indicated how they saw it. Because those species weren't target species, they only recorded the first detection that they had. AV is if you were to hear and see a species at the exact same time. Doesn't happen very often, but you could note that. For our target species, so Sora in this case, and Piedbilled Grebe is also on there, we have folks record minute by minute. So if you heard you heard a Sora in minute 6, and you heard it again at minute 7, you'd say, you'd put an A in both of those columns, and then during minute 8, the bird was quiet, and then it resumed vocalizing in minute 9 during the broadcast. You'd record each minute that the species is observed over the survey period. So as you can see up at the top, we've got the start minute, end minute. So you start your stopwatch, it starts at 0, and you also start your, and we have playback that's run. So you've got 5 minutes of just passive listening playback, followed by 9 minutes of combination of broadcasted vocalizations for each of these species, starting with least bittern, ending with Piedbilled Grebe, interspersed with pauses to listen for responses. And what's interesting is, you may have a Sora respond to the Sora vocalization, or you may have a Sora start when the Virginia rail starts vocalizing. And so that's, something that we want to note here. What vocalization prompted this species to respond? Okay. Then following the actual survey period, we have folks atlas, and the amount of time that you spend atlasing, so looking for signs of breeding behavior within the wetland system, is totally up to you. You could spend 5 minutes, you could spend 30 minutes, and that's looking at both the target species, and any of the other species which you're able to confidently identify. So again, our goal is to gather as much information on these species as possible without impacting their breeding behavior. So that's to say that we're not going out and, bushwhacking looking for nests. We're at a distance scanning the habitat and, listening for vocalizations to inform whether or not a species is breeding within the habitat. So this is a good opportunity to hone your birding by ear skills because, it depends very much on the wetland itself, but in many cases you're more likely to hear these species since either they're hidden within the vegetation or the vegetation is just very thick. For rare species, so as I mentioned, the sedge wren and the least bittern, when those species come up, it's worthwhile to try to get a recording if you're unsure or if you want to confirm that species, and take ample notes. This is something that a lot of times atlasing is done using the app eBird, or that we do have materials for folks that don't want to use a smartphone, but that falls into the general guidance for the Maine Bird Atlas. So as far as when to atlas, when you're assessing the access to your site, when you survey a site, that's a great opportunity to do some atlasing. And then following the playback survey. So each time you make a visit, spend some time exploring the habitat and looking for species. So for instance, this little group of grackles I found right after doing a marsh bird survey. So I was out in my kayak. I noticed a grackle coming and going to this one site. I paddled around the backside of this snag and I found there was a nest inside with 3 super hungry grackles. And we already touched on what to look for. All right, so we have 3 different survey windows, as I had mentioned. They start on May 15th and they run all the way to June 30th. The windows are back to back. And it's during these 3 windows that each of the survey points within your adopted marsh would need to be surveyed. Ideally, these should be spaced the survey should be at least 10 days apart. There's obviously some wiggle room in there due to weather. You wouldn't want to be out there in a downpour or thunderstorm. So if things need to be shifted one way or the other, that's all right, as long as they occur within that window. The reasoning for spacing those surveys out is to limit our disturbance of the species within the marsh, because as we said, the playback can be disruptive. And it's also to raise our surety that, a species that might just be vocalizing, that's singing, if you hear it during one window and then you hear it during the second window and you've spaced these apart adequately, that'll raise our surety that that species is breeding within the marsh, regardless of seeing any other breeding behavior or evidence. If it's there for an extended period of time, then it is probably breeding in that habitat. But okay. So in terms of timing, Within the day, there are some options. You can either survey your marshes during the morning, or you can survey them during the evening. So the morning window is a half an hour before sunrise until 3 hours after sunrise. And the evening window is 2 hours before sunset, running until half an hour after sunset. So these are during peak vocalization periods. Um, Once you choose one of these windows for your marsh, you have to stick with that. So you can't do your surveys in the morning during one window and then do it during the evening in another window. You'd have to consistently do it during the same period, during the same window each time. So if you have a marsh that has a number of points, you've got 5 points within your marsh, the morning window would likely suit better because it's a longer period of time. If you have a single point marsh or 2 points within a marsh that are easy to get to, an evening window can work. Scouting these areas can be really helpful. I had a volunteer contact us recently that they were originally planning to do evening, and they found that the glare was the sunset was creating so much glare that it was really hard for them to see during that period of time within their particular marsh, and that having it front lit by the sunrise would be easier. So that can depend on the marsh itself. So we asked the volunteers to make assessments of the habitat types within these wetland systems. And essentially what you're doing is you're describing them. I'm sorry, I'm pulling my notes up here. So you're determining which habitat type is the most prominent, and then working your way down. So if there's multiple types of habitat, you can make those determinations about which one is the most dominant within your the radius of your survey area, which is about 100 meters or 300 feet. There are a range of different habitat types that were selected when these marshes were selected. So they could be wet meadows where there's really shallow water, or you might not see any water, but you see a number of plant species that help determine that this is a wetland area. You see a lot of sedges. Or they could be on open water sites with either shallow water or deep water, on the margins of lakes or rivers. There are different swamps. So you could end up in a wooded swamp, a silver maple swamp, or a conifer dominated swamp. Or there are shrub swamps. So there's a range of different habitat types. And we have a lot of guidance for you in determining, which habitat you're looking at when you are making assessments that are within our project handbook that we send to all volunteers. So I won't go into the nitty gritty of each of these, but there's a lot that can be said about each. So in terms of access, there's also a range of possibilities. So some of these marshes, they're right on the edge of the road. You can park right on the shoulder of the road, walk a few feet, and you're at your marsh. Easy as that. Others require more more efforts using a canoe or kayak. I did one of those last year, and it was one of my favorite ones. You could paddle to different wetlands along the borders of a lake. Others are off the beaten path and would require you to go off into the Maine woods, into remote areas to access them. So, that's the level of difficulty. We say level of adventure, but level of difficulty is very much up to you and your what you're comfortable doing and what you'd like to do. So we recommend that folks go and scout these sites ahead of time to determine access, to make sure that you're able to reach each of those points easily enough. And that's because And I won't get into the nitty gritty of this today, but these points can be moved if they need to. So if they're in an inaccessible area, there is the ability to move a point. And you don't want to be in a position where you're making that determination on the day that you've gone out to survey. So safety while surveying, I had to, I reused a nightjar picture. You're not going to be out doing surveying in the dark like this, but still come prepared. Bring a headlamp or a flashlight. You know, you're going to be on the edges of the day, so if it takes you a little longer to get out from your survey site, you'll want to make sure that you have a flashlight and a life vest or some very comparable flotation device. And you know, even in areas where water seems really shallow or you're not seeing a lot of water, you know, we highly recommend that you bring and wear a life vest at those sites, because you know, you never know what's beneath the soil in these wet areas. They can be dangerous. So make sure that you have that. If you're surveying from the road, you'll want to make sure that you're parked in a safe area and that you're visible when you're near the roadway. So, you know, have a reflective vest or something. Just make sure that you can be seen. Let someone know where you'll be surveying and when you'll be surveying, and bring a map of the area. You know, it'd be good to bring like one of our Atlas block maps and you know, the map of your marsh, and make sure that someone else has that. You know, feel free to bring a partner along. Only one of you can actually do the survey itself. It's a single observer survey, but no problem with having someone along to keep you company for the ride, and make sure that you're safe and accounted for, and you come back to your vehicle okay. So as far as adopting a marsh, so we have a website. I think Glenn will send you guys the link within the chat, or he may have already done that. But on mainenaturalhistory.org, we have a page dedicated to this project where you can view a lot of details about the project and download some of our materials. But there's also a map that's got all of the marshes that are available for adoption. And you can go through and you can sort of study each of these and you know, find the marsh that makes sense for you. So if you want to go and explore somewhere remote, you've got that option. And let's see, bumped out of my presentation. And if you have any you know, questions, or if you see a marsh that you'd like to adopt, you're going to want to email Glenn at mainbirdatlas@gmail.com with Marshbird survey in the subject. Presently, I'm going to be the person you'll be talking to until the field season starts. So Glenn will forward those messages to me, and we'll you know, get you set up with all the materials that you need. And that would be that your handbook, a map of the marsh, the playback file, and your data sheet. So I'll send you all that information along with the coordinates of each of the points and some access details. So you'll be talking to me for a while, but either way, just email Glenn and he'll forward messages along. So, and then once the season starts and I'm off doing a bunch of different projects, Glenn will be the point person here. All right, so I'm gonna show you the website. So one moment. All right, so this is the website for the Marshbird project. So as you can see, there's all of the details about the project, background information, and this is specifically what I want to show you. We'll just do it on here. Okay, so this Google map has all of the marshes on it. So the larger circles, the white circles with the black borders, those just mark the marshes. You'll see a lot of little red dots on there. Those mark the individual points. So let's hone in here on a marsh. Let's look at this one. So this marsh is marsh, 344 is what it's called. And if I click on this, brings up some details. So it says the site number, the access information. So this is a challenging site to reach, and it's it requires you to either use a boat or to walk in. And all these little red dots, I really wish I could open this in full screen, but it's not cooperating. But these red dots are the survey sites. Okay. So, and they're all numbered. So there's, number 4, there's number 5. I think there's a total of 5 at this wetland. And so you could do that for any of these, and you could go through and you could find ones. Let's say you're from central Maine, you're in the Belgrade area. Well, here's one that doesn't look too hard to access. This marsh, this is 204, has 2 survey points, and they're quite close together. It's right off of 137, so quite accessible. And it should say access, okay, yep. When it says okay, that just means it's an easy access site. Permission, we'll talk about in a moment. So all you would do is you'd go through, you'd find the marsh that works for you. You'd send a message to that email address that I mentioned. Just say, hi, my name is, so-and-so, and I'm interested in adopting and monitoring Marsh 204. And then we would send you all the details that you need for that. Okay. Hopefully that's fairly clear, but we can help you if you run into any snags. All right. Hopefully presentation's good and running. Okay, so permission. So yeah, as I mentioned, as I noted there was a little bit of information on permission. So the majority of the land in the state is owned by private landowners, be they small landowners or larger landowners like the forestry companies. So in the event that a marsh is on private property, we'll help secure access to those sites. In the event that it's needed, that's not necessarily your job to seek out and get permission for those sites. And a number of them are on private lands. If it's posted, that's a different story. If you arrive to your site and you see that there's no trespassing signs, then don't try to access the site. Let us know, and we'll mark that one as a marsh that we can't survey, and we'll set you up with a new marsh, or replace it in the subsequent field season. So that's another advantage to going out and scouting out your site ahead of time, is making sure that the site isn't posted. If you are parked on a roadway, we have the volunteer placard that's used by the Maine Bird Atlas that we ask everyone to display on their vehicles. It gives them information about the project and lets people know that there's not just someone skulking around on their property. But yeah, and it also lets folks know that you're out there working on a project. So, but yeah, so in the event that you come across private posted land, just get in touch with one of us. And that would be Glenn. I'd email Glenn if you run into that. All right, so as far as supporting this project, so as a special species project, the Adopt-a-Marsh program is supported by the Sponsor Species program of the Maine Bird Atlas. And this is a program where you can adopt any of the species that we have here in Maine. You can adopt them for 1 year or up to 5 years. Each year has a different amount associated with it, and some of them are very inexpensive, or if you want to make a really large contribution, there are those as well. But the cool thing about this program, in addition to the fact that you're helping to support special species projects like this project and the Nightjar project and the Owl project, but you'll also be included within the final print copy of the atlas on that that species page. So your name would appear within the atlas, which is super cool. And if you wanted to do a dedication to a friend or family member, you could do that as well, and they would be included. So they make great gifts and on top of everything. So we'd appreciate your support. And I got bounced on my presentation again, but so here's some additional resources. I think Glenn is either going to send that or he's already sent a number of these, but as I mentioned, the project site for the Adopt-a-Marsh project. If you're new to the Maine Bird Atlas project, visit maine.gov/bird atlas, and you can see all of the details you need to get yourself started with that. There are a number of other special species projects, as I mentioned, so there's details on those other projects and other guidance for, looking for other tough to study species. And then I just included a few links to websites that are useful for listening to bird vocalizations or viewing photographs, or All About Birds has a lot of information on making IDs. So if you're less familiar with a species and you want to become more familiar, that's a great tool. You can compare with other likely to be confused species. So with that, I think we'll stop the formal part of the presentation here, and we will switch over to questions. And let's see, how many participants do we have right now, Glenn?
27. But we've actually got a couple of questions in the chat from
oh, great. Let's start there.
So somebody was asking what the geographic distribution of these wetland species were within the state.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So in some sense, you can help us determine that. So a lot of these species haven't been documented in a lot of these areas, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not there, but it's a range. So some of these species are widely distributed. I think most of these species you'll find have ranges that include most of the state. The exceptions, well, yeah, I mean, sedge wren is sort of thought of as a more coastal species, but they do appear further inland occasionally at certain sites. We don't have a lot of information on the distribution of American coot and common gallinule. So they are seen in central Maine up to, the areas around, Bangor and south. But again, they may be, more distributed. As far as species like Virginia rail and American bittern, Piedbilled Grebe, they're likely to be found throughout much of the state, wherever the habitat is suitable.
Yeah, and there is somebody who was asking when filling out the form, what to do with multiple birds, non-target birds.
Like, oh, that's a great question. Yeah,
multiple red-winged blackbirds. You can get a ton of blackbirds. So
right.
How to deal with that on a data sheet.
Yeah, so it is set up so that each species has its own individual line. So one line for one bird. And you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, Glenn. So if you do have a number of species that appear all at once, and you're not able to quickly write down all of those species all at once, you could write down the first species and then mark a section of your data sheet and go back and fill that in after the fact. I don't think you need to quickly write red-winged blackbird, 20 times on your data sheet in the field when you've got other species, other target species, especially that are vocalizing. Is that a fair summary of what to do in that instance?
Yep, no, I'd say so. And a question just came in, wondering if we're also interested in marshes that aren't on the map, or were those marshes targeted for a reason?
You might be able to speak better to why those individual marshes were chosen. I wasn't involved in that process. Speaking about marshes that are not part of this, I would say yes, we are definitely interested in those as well. Really from the atlasing lens, especially marshes that are in the priority blocks, which are blocks that we've flagged as priorities for completing as part of the Maine Bird Atlas project. So, when you're atlasing and completing blocks, you want to get into as many different habitat types as possible. So, these specialized surveys, serve a role, and but we are certainly interested in other marsh and wetland habitat types. So, if you were to adopt one or two of these marshes, and then of some other marshes in your area or that are in Atlas blocks that you're interested in, certainly would encourage folks to look at both areas.
Yeah, and with these selected marshes, the 200 marshes, they were selected to help give us some information statewide on marsh birds. So they were randomly selected for a reason. Some of them are going to have interesting, target species in them. Some of them aren't, but that's to be expected. And somebody was asking, what are the resources for determining location of public access? I know that you spend a lot of time, Logan, looking up public access on these. So what do you use?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. So I did a lot of that last spring. So the first resource, I guess, would be the marsh adoption map. So that's your first place to look. That can give you some clues as to if a site is marked as okay, that it's accessible, or if it's privately owned. At that point, you'd want to contact one of the, you'd probably contact Glenn or the project director, Adrian, who are handling some of the larger landowner sites. So we did collect a lot of information on making contact with folks in the event that, you arrive and a site is marked, for instance, so you arrive and the site is marked access by permission only. We might be able to set you up with contact information to send a letter, or we may have already made contact with that person. So so really on your end, it's looking at the map, seeing if a site is marked. If you scout the site and you come across a site that it looks like you're going to need permission, reach out to the project coordinator.
And somebody was asking about, do we want the data entered into the breeding atlas or just recording on the sheet only?
Yeah, so you can record it. You certainly record it on your data sheet, but you can record it in the Maine Bird Atlas that can be added. We have a spot on the data sheet where you can mark whether or not you have already done that. That's important. So while you're welcome to upload your own data, and in some ways that's really helpful, it's not required, but it is required that you let us know if you did or didn't do that, because the last thing we want to do is upload something twice and end up with multiples of the same record being uploaded onto eBird.
And that's all the questions we have. I was just posting a link for the marsh map
Great.
on the website. But if anyone else has any questions, you can unmute yourself and and ask them
Yeah,
directly.
definitely. All right, well, I can start wrapping up here. So first off, I just want to apologize and say thank you for your patience while I had that technical interruption. Hopefully my laptop will recover, but we will see. We do have a recording. We do, right? Have a recording of this presentation, Glenn. You recorded it, didn't you? Yeah, okay. So Glenn recorded it, so we'll be able to upload that, and I will edit out my disappearance midway through the presentation. It'll be like it never happened. And we'll send that out to folks if you want to rewatch any of these. We will try to get that up within the next week or so. Let's see, is there more going on in the chat? No. Okay, cool. All right. So yeah, feel free to reach out to Glenn or myself. Like I said, if you send a message to Glenn right now about the project, he's likely going to forward it to me. So you'll be hearing from me. But again, thank you all for your interest, and hope to see a number of marshes getting adopted. All right. Thanks very much.